Hello class, today we're going to do a little lecture on Corcoran's book, Rethinking Human Nature. We're going to do chapter 2. So chapter 1 dealt with dualism. We talked some about dualism in a couple of varieties. We're going to do the same thing now, except we're going to talk about materialism. If you'll remember, we talked about what does it mean to be a human person, what constitutes a human person. We had a few options. One is a dualistic option. We are both bodies and souls, body and spirit, physical and non-physical. Again, the easy way to think dual is two. Another option is materialism, which we're going to talk about today, that the only thing that exists is matter. We call it a monism, meaning only one type of substance or reality exists, and in this case they would argue it's physical. And then the third option, which we'll cover in subsequent lectures, is Corcoran's view, which is the constitution view. So today we're going to talk about materialism. Again, this does not mean a person who likes fancy cars and nice clothes and is very materialistic. Materialism is, matter is all that exists. A clarification needs to be made. This is one that Corcoran makes in the chapter, but it's very short, and so a lot of times readers will not pick up on it. I just want to highlight it. There is a difference between methodological naturalism and metaphysical naturalism. I want to talk about that briefly. Methodological naturalism, as you can see, right? Scientific explanations must exclude reference to supernatural or immaterial entities. Science is in the business of discovering natural causes, patterns, and laws. Science is unable to make conclusions regarding metaphysics and the supernatural. Methodological naturalism essentially says, if you're a scientist, you're going to do your research, you're there to look for natural causes, natural explanations, laws, consistent elements found in nature, things that are repeatable. And so you're going to limit your research and your scope to natural causes and laws and whatnot. So if I'm a doctor, I have a patient, I'm trying to figure out what's the cause of their symptoms. I'm going to look at their blood work. I'm going to try to find elements in their body, in their brain, in their circulatory system that seem to be irregular, and then figure out natural ways we might fix it through medication or surgery. Nothing supernatural about it. Methodological naturalism suggests that that doctor should not look at a patient whose heart is not operating properly. One of the ventricles isn't doing its job correctly, or maybe their arteries and veins are really clotted, and then make claims about demon possession, right? That would be a supernatural explanation for this, and that lies outside the realm of science. And so maybe that's true, but it's certainly something that the methods of science cannot touch. So methodological naturalism is sort of using the methods of science. We want to have explanations that not only work on this human body that are particular to this person, but that we can use, on down the line with other humans facing the same issue with their heart. Or if I'm a physicist and I'm trying to figure out how to get the space shuttle through the atmosphere, I've got to do physics to figure out what speed and what angle and trajectory. We're not just going to rely on prayer to get the space shuttle through the atmosphere. We're going to actually work on laws of nature, science, and mathematics to figure out exactly what has to happen. These things are repeatable, they're verifiable, we can use our senses and our reason to figure them out. That we're using the methods of science there, not the methods of religion or some other supernatural element. Corcoran argues methodological naturalism is perfectly compatible with Christianity. A Christian scientist can go to work trying to figure out the laws of nature and math that will help the space shuttle get to outer space, and then go home and still pray to God, pray for the astronauts, read scripture, go to church. There's no incongruity there. It just means when I'm doing science, I'm using the methods of science. And outside of that, science doesn't touch it. So it remains more of a mystery, more about an issue of faith, right? There are lots of issues about God, life after death, ultimate morality and whatnot that science just isn't relevant for. So for Corcoran, being a methodological naturalist does not exclude them from being a Christian. I hope not, because I often want to implement methodological naturalism when I'm doing philosophy. And I think sometimes the methods of science are really helpful, often very helpful in solving problems, both philosophical and otherwise. And yet I don't limit myself to methodological naturalism in my faith. Contrast this with metaphysical naturalism. This is a metaphysical view that says there is no non-physical reality. Everything that exists is matter. Everything can be reduced to its physical components, right? This nothing but reductionary attitude goes beyond the scope of what science can tell us. It enters into a metaphysical dialogue. Can science tell us that there are no non-physical entities in the world? Is it possible for science to show us that? It seems not. So we've gone beyond the bounds of science to make metaphysical claims about the nature of ultimate reality. In the process, metaphysical naturalism eliminates the idea that there can be a God, at least a non-physical God, because no non-physical entity exists. So it's now making religious claims. Metaphysical naturalism makes it difficult to explain life after death, so it's got certain ramifications with regard to religion. But overall, I want you to see the difference, right? Does that make sense? Methodological naturalism using the methods of science to come to conclusions. Metaphysical naturalism, which steps beyond that and makes claims about the nature of ultimate reality. I think that this claim, metaphysical naturalism, is incompatible with Christianity for the most part. There might be some layers of compatibility, but I think there's also some fundamental incompatibility. And I think that's a major, like an important distinction between the two. And I think often they get confused. The metaphysical view, metaphysical naturalism, this metaphysical view is often referred to as materialism. We've talked about that. Corcoran refers to two different versions of materialism. Person-body identity, which is a form of materialism, and animalism, which is also a version of materialism. And so that will be in your reading. Okay. So, support for materialism. How do we get here, right? This, I think, and Corcoran makes this clear, this is sort of the default position for many scientists and for many, this is the default position for many scientists, materialism is. It's also the default position for many philosophers. So how did this happen? A lot stems from the success in neuroscience and brain research. It used to be that if you wanted to talk about human behavior, morality, human personality, rationality, decision-making, freedom, if you wanted to refer to these things, which are often the very core of what it means to be human, you had to sort of refer to a soul. So our bodies are machines. They've got instincts and drives, maybe propensity for sex, to find food, like other animals. But humans have this higher order thinking, consciousness, self-awareness, morality, freedom. Well, that must be because we have this divine element that is our soul. But as we learn more about the human brain, we start to realize that no, your decision-making is fundamentally tied to how well your brain functions. When your brain doesn't function well, it completely affects your decision-making. We know that a person's personality is tied to their genetics, and personalities can change when brain injuries occur. We know that memory is fundamentally tied to the brain. We know that there's a strong connection between morality and brain activity. So as evidence arises with regards to neuroscience in the brain, the purpose, the function of the soul gets smaller and smaller and smaller. We needed the soul to explain these things initially, and now we don't anymore. It seems as though there's not this non-physical mind, right? And this can be seen in easy ways. So if someone drinks too much alcohol, often their personality changes. They can become violent and aggressive or withdrawn and depressed. They lose coordination. Their judgment is impaired. Their moral decision-making is changed. But all that's going on is you're drinking a physical substance that then is affecting the chemistry in your brain. Yet all these things change. Well, if who I am, my moral compass, my decision-making, my personality, if that's all part of a non-physical soul, how could a physical substance like alcohol affect it so badly? It seems that all those things really are just brain functioning, and alcohol we know affects brain functioning and therefore affects those things. We see a straight causal connection, right? Concomitant variation. You remember Mill's 3 methods of causation? The more a person drinks, the more their personality changes, the less coordinated they become, the more volatile. We could talk about the same thing happens when a person doesn't get enough sleep or when they take other kinds of drugs, decision-making impaired, personality changes, all this. We now know that we can give a person serotonin for depression, and it often changes their mood, their personality, their decisions, their whole outlook on life. It's a physical substance. If who I am is fundamentally non-physical, how can a physical substance radically change who I am? So these things start to show, well, wow, it looks like who we are is fundamentally tied to our brains. And then we can use a principle like Occam's razor, right here. Occam's razor says, if you have 2 explanations, one is simple and the other complex, and yet both go to explaining the phenomenon in hand, the simple solution is usually, inductive argument, usually the right one. So if I'm a detective and I stumble onto the scene of a crime and we have a dead body and a person standing over that dead body with a smoking gun in hand, motive, opportunity to kill, we typically say, oh, well, that person's probably guilty of shooting the person to death. We're not going to concoct some grand scheme about the mob and some underlying person, and maybe someone shot this man, dropped the gun, this person happened to just come along, pick it up, right? We're not going to create an elaborate plot unless there's some evidence to suggest that we need to create a more complicated story. As long as the simple story fits all the evidence, that's probably the right one, right? And we use this all the time in our lives. I often put a bunch of socks into the wash. I know I put them in pairs. I take them off 2 at a time. I put them into my dirty clothes. I take the dirty clothes. I wash them, dry them. Yet somehow, when I'm folding the laundry, I inevitably have a missing sock. Where did that sock go? Well, what happened? Well, I could make the case that maybe it's cramped in my closet. Maybe when I put it in my dirty clothes, it fell behind. Maybe my dog got a hold of it. Maybe when I was transferring from the washer to the dryer, one fell in between the machines. All those would make sense, but if someone said, well, no, I think there are invisible sock snatchers. They're invisible aliens that steal socks, and that's where they go, because we all have this problem, I assume. I'm not the only one who ends up with one sock without a pair. Well, someone's going to say, well, why would I postulate invisible aliens when there's probably an easier explanation, a simple explanation like my dog or it's in the bottom of my closet or something. We use this Occam's razor, this principle of inductive logic, all the time. As a side note, I do have a theory. Every time I clean out my dryer, by the way, I scoop out a giant thing of lint. Right. To me, that's a sock right there. I could probably weave that together. I think my dryer blows up at least one sock, and then it just, all the lint sucks into the lint collector, and I think that's probably where my sock goes. But the idea is this. If we've got dualism on one hand and materialism on the other, and materialism says we can explain human behavior, human personality, human decision-making, and all of that with brain research, data where we can get our hands on, and that explains humans adequately. And dualism wants to say, well, yeah, we have all of that, but we also have this weird, immaterial, eternal, non-physical soul that floats off to heaven when we die with no evidence. The scientist wants to say Occam's razor suggests the simplest solution is materialism, and therefore it's likely true. What does dualism add to the explanation with regard to human people, right? Maybe you can make a faith-based claim, I just believe that I have a spirit, but in terms of an actual argument, philosophical or scientific, what evidence do we have? And so it starts to lose ground as neuroscience progresses, right? So that's sort of how Occam's razor might work in this scenario. Phineas Gage is a famous example of this. He you see his dates. He's a railroad worker He's out working. He's like stamping down, right? He's using his long pipe to sort of prep the railroad, and they're using dynamite at the time to, like, blow through mountains if they need to, certain canyons and whatnot, to keep this railroad going. So sure enough, he stamps down, ignites one of the pieces of dynamite, and this rod, I mean, it's a large rod, shoots through his face. I mean, it goes underneath his eye, out, takes off part of his frontal lobe, and shoots out the top of his head. It ends up landing like 50 feet away. And this is, again, look at the date here, I think it was 1840 or something like that, 1845. And yet, he doesn't die, he lives. I mean, they essentially get the bleeding stopped. He loses eyesight in the eye where it went through, but he lives. He's actually able to go back to work after some recovery time. And so this seems to be a miracle. But what happens is the gauge that existed before the accident was very different than the gauge that exists after the accident. Before, he was a hard worker, smart, determined, got along with his coworkers, was a good husband, but, not perfect, but by all accounts a decent guy. But after the accident, he's described as being sort of poor memory, rash, mean, has a hard time getting along with his coworkers, is angry with his wife. So much so that his wife and his coworkers, if you look down here, would describe him as not really Gage. Like, he's Gage, but not really. Totally different human being as a result of this frontal lobe injury. And the idea is, it's not like he changed in peripheral ways. He changed in fundamental ways, behaviorally, attitudinally, personality, morally. So much of him was different as a result, right? And so cases like this fuel materialism. We are our brains. There's an identity there. My thoughts, my mind, and all that's associated with that, my consciousness, is identical with brain activity. Change the brain activity, change all this other stuff, right? And we know the frontal lobe is integral in social knowledge and intelligence. It's integral in decision making. There are certain moral emotions like guilt and whatnot associated with the frontal lobe. So it's no wonder that this injury hurt him. Sometimes students say things like, well, of course Phineas Gage changed. The guy has a hole in his head. I mean, if a rod went through my head, I would change too. I'd be grumpy and mean and nasty because, you couldn't have felt good, right? And now you've got post-traumatic stress and all that. And that's fair enough. But I think it's not sufficient to respond to the evidence. Here's a picture of Gage. You see the rod he's holding. This rod went through his head. Look at that. I mean, that's crazy. You can see he lost sight in that eye. The problem with saying, well, Gage had this traumatic event and that's the problem, is research since then has shown conclusively, I would argue, that similar things happen when similar areas of the brain are damaged. The most famous, Antonio Damasio, he wrote an influential book called Descartes' Error. I have put a chapter of this book on Angel. It's not required, but if this stuff interests you, you can look at Damasio's research on other people with frontal lobe damage, and you can see similar effects. And so there starts a pattern emerges. He calls his book Descartes' Error because part of the book is showing that when the emotions associated with the frontal lobe are hindered, so as the frontal lobe is damaged, emotions that operate as a result of that frontal lobe activity are changed. And when the emotions are changed, we see how it affects decision making. So Descartes argues that we are these very rational, thinking things, and he often ignores emotion. And Damasio wants to say he's downplayed this very vital thing. So he cites over 20 different patients with frontal lobe damage. All of these patients show decreased social knowledge, poor decision-making skills, and many of them show strong signs of acquired sociopathy or psychopathy. Essentially, many of these become sociopaths. They have a hard time feeling guilt. They don't respond normally when they're shown images of people being beaten or killed. Most of us are horrified, and certain involuntary things, blood pressure, heart rate, things go up when we're exposed to those images. Many people with frontal lobe damage have none of those responses. They have a hard time looking at a person's facial expression and understanding what they're feeling. So empathy is very difficult for them. And this is common, again, and the research continues to mount, suggesting that we are fundamentally tied to our brains. And so the wave pushing materialism forward, right, continues. So some conclusions we've already talked about. A person's identity, intelligence, moral awareness, etc., is fundamentally tied to their brains. Corcoran calls this person-body identity, this view, that I'm identical with my body or my brain, right? It's person-body identity. I'm not suggesting materialism is true, so don't get me wrong, but I am suggesting that if a person wants to be a dualist, they have to take this research seriously. They have to take this into account because it's mounting. And this is where I think Christians really need to be engaged in the sciences, need to know about the brain, need to be experts in this research, because if we're going to mount arguments for dualism, and I'm not saying we need to, but if we're going to, we have to be aware of this. Excuse me. Excuse me. They often come in twos, so that might happen again. Okay, so person-body identity. Corcoran gives you sort of these premise conclusions on page 48. Person-body identity. Either a human person is identical with his or her body, or a person is identical with some non-physical thing, right? We have one or the other. Premise 2, there are no non-physical things in existence. I would support, if I were a materialist, I would support this saying, there's no need to cite a non-physical entity because of the success of brain research. We can show that human persons, human thoughts, mental activity is fundamentally tied to the brain. Therefore, a human person is identical with his or her body, and our mental states are fundamentally identical with our brain states. Now, Corcoran rightly says that this seems to be a false dichotomy. Remember this from the fallacies we covered in the first week of class. If you say a person is either this or that, but there are other legitimate options, then you've created a false dichotomy, right? The strategy is obvious. We're either physical things or we have this non-physical entity, the soul, that helps us think. We don't need a non-physical entity like the soul to explain why we think. We just need the brain. Therefore, we have two options. We eliminate one of the options. We're left with the second option, right? Two options, eliminate one. What's left has to be true. The problem, of course, is if there are more than two options, then let's say you've got three options. I eliminate one. I still have two left, right? And you haven't even addressed the third. And this was Corcoran's point, because Corcoran wants to put forth the Constitution view, which isn't addressed here, right? Corcoran rejects dualism as well. He rejects both dualism and materialism in favor of a third view, which I'm also in favor of. So he thinks this creates a false dichotomy. Corcoran does not, you should note, attack neuroscience. He thinks that human persons cannot think, will not have mental activity without our brains. Our bodies are sort of necessary components for our identity and for our spirituality and for our thought. Our bodies and our brains are necessary. But Corcoran says, but they are not sufficient. I cannot be reduced to my brain. My identity cannot be reduced to my body, to the physical components that make me who I am. So that those components are necessary, whereas with dualism, they're not. The only thing that's necessary is my soul. He says the body is necessary, the brain is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Therefore, when the materialist wants to reduce me and say, I'm nothing but my brain activity, Corcoran says, no. Brain activity is necessary, but it is not sufficient. There's more to the story. And I think that's important to point out. So he accepts the stuff with Gage. He accepts the stuff with neuroscience. It's overwhelming. It just keeps flooding in. He just says, we can't be reduced to that stuff. The other view he mentions is animalism. Premise 1 of animalism, there is a human animal sitting in my chair, right? That human animal sitting in my chair is thinking. I am the thinking being sitting in my chair. The one and only thinking thing sitting in the chair is me. Therefore, I am a thinking animal. That's what I am. Animalism is just another form of materialism. It gets away from person-body identity for various reasons. Corcoran mentioned several problems with person-body identity. Again, this is not to replace your reading. This is a supplement to your reading, so I'm not going to go through all of that, but I do want you to read it. But as a result of some of those objections, animalism comes on the scene and says, okay, let's get away from person-body identity, but certainly the human being is nothing more than a thinking animal, a complex animal. That's all we are, right? Still in a materialistic framework. Which premise do you think Corcoran wants to attack here? 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? Take a look. Where do you think he's going to go? Or do you think maybe he's going to agree with the premises and just disagree with the conclusion? He goes after premise 2. So we can go back. He goes after premise 2. The human animal sitting in my chair is thinking. Interesting. Why would he disagree with that? The human animal sitting in my chair is thinking. Here's his argument. He asked the question, do my eyes see, or do I see in virtue of my eyes? Corcoran argues, my eyes don't see anything. My eye, whoever is behind the eyes, I see in virtue of them, right? But without me, my eyes don't see anything. Without consciousness, without a sense of personal identity, without a person behind the eyes don't see, right? A dead person's eyes see nothing. So my eyes don't see, I see in virtue of my eyes. Does my hand vote? Or do I vote in virtue of raising my hand? Right? He says hands don't vote, people vote. I just use my hand to indicate what my vote is. But I, some conscious person, some entity, some identity behind the hand raises it. Therefore, the I is separate from my brain. The I might need the brain to think. So I think in virtue of my brain, but I am not identical to my brain. I see in virtue of my eyes, but I am not identical to my eyes. I vote in virtue of my hand, but I am not identical to my hand. So Corcoran says, bodies are necessary, brains are necessary for my identity, for my consciousness, for who I am. But you cannot reduce who I am, my identity, and my consciousness down to that. It's an emergent property. Consciousness emerges up out of brain states but cannot be reduced to them. It's a higher order phenomena now. More goes into it. And so I'm not an animal that thinks, right? I happen to be a thinking thing that thinks in virtue of my body and my brain. And so he critiques animalism as such. Again, there's a lot more to the chapter, but I wanted to highlight a little bit of this to see how he makes these philosophical arguments and where he's going. I think it's a big mistake to try to deny science and reject some of the evidence that we have about the human person and the human brain. At the same time, I want to reject materialism. I want to reject those arguments that want to reduce me to nothing more than my physical components. And I want to say that something else is going on. And Corcoran leaves us, at the very end of this chapter on page 64, he sort of leaves us with an allusion to the next chapter, where he's going. And his argument is, we are wholly physical creatures. And think about, I mean, that's close to materialism here, right? We are wholly physical creatures constituted by our bodies and our brains without being identical with them. And that's key. And this is going to be parsed out in the next chapter. He's going to argue that this view is compatible with Scripture, with Christian orthodoxy, and can be defended using strong philosophical arguments. I hope this helps. If you have any questions at all, let me know, and I'll look forward to seeing you online.